Hello and welcome to the Ride Around the Murray Festival 2021 program, Reshaped for Online Presentation. My name's Anne-Marie, WAM Festival Director, and I'm talking to you from the Albury Library Museum here on Wiradjuri country. I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people as the traditional custodians of the land on which the festival makes its home, and pay respect to elders past, present and future, for they hold the memories, culture, traditions and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that contribute to our community. A big thank you to all of you who are with us this evening from the local Albury area and from all around the country, including those of you watching this as a replay later. We truly appreciate your support of the Ride Around the Murray Festival and of literature and storytelling and the arts more broadly. Where's my notes? I'd also like to thank the Friends of the Albury Libraries and Museum who have sponsored this session tonight. We're thrilled to be able to present this evening's session, Complicated Love, with Emily Maguire, Sofie Laguna, Campbell, Mattinson and Jason Steger. Thanks to all of them for coming online with us. It's my pleasure to welcome our dear friend of the festival, Jason Steger, our literary editor for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, though Hello. He needs no introduction to WAM audiences or literary audiences. Jason keeps readers in the loop with all sorts of book news with his digital newsletter, The Book List, every Friday that people can subscribe to for free. Keep up to date with all things bookish. And Jason has moderated a good many author conversations for WAM over the years. Great to have you with us again, Jason.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Before I hand over to Jason to introduce our panel, I'll just let listeners know that you'll be able to type questions for the panel at any time using the chat bar on the right side of your screen, just as long as you're logged into Google. And Jason will come to your questions toward the end of this session. So enjoy the conversation, everyone. Over to you, Jason.
Thanks very much, Anne-Marie. It's very, very nice to be back, not quite in Albury, but back with Route Around the Murray, which is such a wonderful festival. And I would have been very disappointed to miss out. I'm speaking to you from the land of the Lukit Willem clan of the Boonwurrung people, and I pay my respects as well to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, the subject we are talking about today is complicated love. And let's face it, over the hundreds of years that novels and poetry have been written, love must be the subject that's been most frequently addressed. And this evening's session suggests not much has changed. As Anne-Marie said, the writers thrashing out this tricky subject are Sofie Laguna, Emily Maguire and Campbell Mattinson. And we will be considering the topic through their most recent novels, Infinite Splendours by Sofie, Emily's Love Objects, and Campbell's We Were Not Men. So, complicated love. Crikey, isn't it always complicated? Surely there's no other way, is there? Because let's face it, there's so much more to love than saying, I love you. And the other thing is anyone's love ever the same as anyone else's? When it comes to writing about it, though, I quite like the view of the British critic John Carey. He wrote, in our culture, love needs a mixer before it qualifies as a subject for literature. Pour it out neat and you get Mills and Boon. Well, none of our writers with us today has written a Mills and Boon, and their books are all very different, and the mixers they have in them are all very different. Sofie writes about a love of art and nature, but also a darker sort of love, a love from an adult man for a boy. Emily writes about an obsessive love for objects. Her main character is a hoarder, but there's also another character's disturbing experience of love that she dwells on, and it's quite eye-opening, I thought. And Campbell writes about twin boys, and their love of swimming, their profound, deep, very, very profound love for each other, and their love for their grandmother, who sort of adopts them after their parents are killed. Those are very bold summaries of the books that have great texture and depth. And actually, although I say all the loves in their books are very different, different from each other, there is one common denominator: family. But then, let's face it, they're always complicated as well. So please welcome Sofie Laguna, Emma Maguire, and Campbell Mattinson. Hello.
Hi, everyone.
We're all there.
Hello.
Well, complicated love, quite a subject. So I wondered, firstly, whether each of you could tell us about the portrayal of love in your novels, and tell us what it was that got you started writing about that particular portrayal of love. And who would like to go first?
Well, why don't I just throw myself in at the deep end? You know, as you were asking the question, I was thinking about how the novel began and thinking about love in the novel. And the novel, I suppose, didn't begin with love, in that my first impulse for the novel was about a man in his early 50s who needed to go underground, physically needed to remove himself from the ordinary world on the surface of the earth and go underground. And so he began as a monologue describing what that experience was like, literally, you know, handwritten notes describing what it was to go into a bunker space that he built himself, that he would go into over many, many years. And then the love in the novel really built as the days went by, as I learned his relationships, as I learned his past, as I learned who his family was, and what gave him the need to have to go into that bunker space underground. So love took its time, I suppose. And yeah.
And gradually emerged during the course of the creation of the character Lawrence.
It deepened every time I wrote the story. When I say it, you know, it took its time, it didn't take long. I mean, the tendrils sort of began to grow pretty quickly, you know, as I learned that connection with his brother and what that was. So each it's interesting, isn't it? Because each time you write, it's an act of love. Each time you write the book, it's an act of devotion. And each time, each day, and each moment that you're spending with the character, the love between the two of you is growing, or at least the bond is growing. The knowledge of who your character is and what their story is growing. And you could argue, couldn't you, that that is an act of love, even for your villains. You're spending time with them. You're
bringing them to life, aren't you?
You're bringing them to life, and that is an act of devotion that is. I keep using the word built, which isn't the word I want, but it's increasing with every moment that you're immersed in the words that tell that story.
So do you think the first, and I mean, I'd be interested in everybody's view of this, the first element of love in the books is therefore for your characters, the love that you feel for them?
For me, I would say not love to start with, certainly not in the case of this book, but real deep curiosity. I think for me, this book started with a character who herself has this really profound love, as you said in the intro, Jason, for objects, for things.
Yeah.
Which is something that I'm deeply, deeply interested in, both in people who might be labelled hoarders, but also just generally our human relationship to our stuff. And so what I had was a really deep curiosity about her, about this woman who seems to have chosen objects over people, in the sense that her home is kind of crowded out any human contact. And then as I went through that writing process, I definitely came to really love her, and really understand that it obviously isn't that simple, that it's not a choice between objects and people, and that, you know, this complicated love that she has in her life, mostly for her niece and nephew, who they're not her own kids. They've been moved away from her, and she has this sort of grief and loss that she can't do anything with, and that's sort of tangled up in these objects as well.
And the objects in her home, but they have meaning for her, don't they? They take her to places where she's been, experiences that she's had. They have meaning and significance. They're not just objects.
No, and I guess this is something that I was really loved exploring in this, is that, you know, there's a lot of labels put on people, and hoarder is the big one, of course, the character. I've actually had a lot to do with people who have hoarding behaviour and did a lot of deep research. And the thing that is just incredibly obvious once you delve into it is that the kind of things that these people are saying about their stuff is not any different than what any of us say about our stuff. It's just applied to more of those things. So I could ask you, Jason, about the pieces of art that are behind you there. Yep. And each of those things would have a story attached to it, whether it's making or where you got it, or who gave it to you, or whatever it brings up. And we all have those things, whether it's art or, you know, anything, basically. If you go into someone's house and say, tell me about this person who a moment ago might have said, I don't care about material things, will have all this story. So someone like Nick in my book, it's just that applies to almost everything rather than a limited number of items. But that sense that, you know, I've done this test with people before, if I'm sitting across from them back in those days, where I'll say to someone, take your wedding ring and throw it in that bin. And it can be a completely clean paper bin. You can get it back afterwards. People feel really wrong doing that. It feels like such an act of betrayal to throw a piece of jewelry or even place it gently in there. It feels ick. And that's the kind of feeling that Nick has for pretty much all of her objects, that whatever their story, invented, or actual memories of hers, to discard those objects is actually discarding that feeling that's associated with that.
Yeah, I mean, because they are prompts, aren't they? And I mean, it's brilliant when, in the course of the novel, Nick at home has a fall, and that's how her niece eventually discovers that she is surrounded by stuff, because she and while she's lying on the ground and she's injured, she can see something glinting under the bed, and it's I think it's a sort of plastic tiara that was a mock Princess Diana tiara, isn't it? And that just sort of sends her off in it's almost Proustian, isn't it? You know, how the whole, you know, you could have started a 12-volume novel with that scene.
Oh, I mean, it's so just gorgeous for a novelist and a writer too to delve into this, because it is stories within stories within stories. Every object and what they mean. You can, you know, it's a beautiful thing to think about the lives of objects and of what they mean to their owners. And also something Nick does, which quite a few people I've known have done, is to think about the creation of an object as well, which is something that probably in this real throwaway society a lot of us could afford to do a little bit more, which is to really think about the work that went into something. You know, I remember sitting with one woman and what I thought was basically a pile of rags. And as she picked up each item to tell me about it, she would be pointing out like really fine needlework or lace or the print on it, and just this real attention and thinking about someone made that. And not true of every item. There's mass-produced things, all of that, but there's still labour that went into it. There's still care, and to actually think about that, the hands that an item has passed through and what's gone into it. To me, that is something that's really filled with love. That's way beyond the object. It's kind of a love of humanity and not wanting anyone's effort to be discarded.
Campbell, love, your book is actually described as a novel about love, and I mean it's on the back. Well, I have my copy is a proof copy, but it says this is a novel about love, and I just was that your starting point?
It is a story. It is a novel about love. I would kind of
I wasn't in any way disagreeing with that.
Yeah. Either am I. For me, it's more a book about loss and recovering from loss and moving towards love than it is the starting point being love, if that makes sense. So in the writing of it, it was all about loss and recovery and healing for me. So yeah, but it's interesting here. I mean, Sophie's point that the act of writing is kind of an act of love, I just think is beautifully put. And given, I mean, just given that I started writing this book a long time ago, and it was on my mind for decades, just the kind of story itself. You know, I used to refer to it as my best friend. It was like my mate. It was
that's cool.
It was the end of the night, you know, put your arm around your mate. It was this book.
So
that's right.
It really was 30 years that you spent on it.
Yeah, I know the date because the genesis of the book, or the day that I started writing, a kind of loose friend, he wasn't a close friend, but somebody who I had invested some hopes and dreams in because he was so exceptional, died tragically. And in the aftermath of that, or in fact, the day of his funeral, I sat down and started writing this book. And so I can go and check, you know, what that date was. I know that that's the week that I started. That's when I wrote the first word.
Wow.
And although it took 30 years, I actually finished the first draft in the first 6 months. So I actually had 150,000 words in the first 6 months, and wasn't happy with it. And it was kind of the funny, well, you know, we're talking about love. The thing that I wasn't happy about was the grandmother Bobby. I thought that it was a book about boys, and it was a book about their romantic journey, kind of, and their recovery and their loss. And the grandmother character who looks after them, I felt like she was just a little bit too placeholder-ish.
Right.
And so over that time, it became a story about the boy. Like, it went from a story that was overtly about the boys and their journey, and kind of became a story about the development of their love for their grandmother. And so she had to become a lot bigger character for that to work.
Well, and so in effect, does that mean you spent 29 years with the grandmother, not with the boys?
Yeah, pretty much. Though that said, the obviously the other element of the book is, because the boys are twins or very close brothers, is the relationship with the brothers. And I think, given my own relationship with my own brother, I think in many ways that's actually the crux of the story, is how each brother sees each other. Like it is love, but it's something else too. The word approval comes to mind, but it's something more than that, because it's the twin brother.
I mean, Bobby, the grandmother, is a fantastic character, though. I mean, okay, you spent a long time honing her, but boy, she's great. She's a really great character, I think. You know,
well, the funny thing is, I think that the book started with, you know, the narrator loosely being me, and I think it finished with Bobby kind of being me.
Bobby being you.
You know, not really me, but just, you know, I guess I started off identifying with the narrator and ended up identifying with Bobby, just because I was 30 years older.
But so, Campbell, did it take that long, do you think, to complete the novel, or was there a part of yourself resisting finishing it, do you think? Or was that the time that it took?
Well, there's two things. I think, yes, there was a certain fear of failure beyond a certain point. You've just built it up too much.
Yeah.
But I also think, and it's a funny thing, I see it in other areas of life, but I think beyond a certain point, when it's taken 20 years, without you realizing it, because you've got so many scenes, so many pages, so many different files, you find that you're actually looking for the shortest way home rather than the right way home. Like it seems strange when you've taken 30 years, but you're actually looking for shortcuts. And rather than and the turning point for me, and I look at teams that were like football teams that were successful in the 80s or 90s or whatever, and you go, if you could have told them then that it was going to be 30 years before their next premiership, they probably would have organised things differently. And if you told me in 1990 it was going to take me 30 years, I would have done things very differently. And in fact, even though it took 30 years, I kind of threw it all out 3 years ago and started from scratch, and then wrote it from apart from the opening scene. I wrote it from scratch from there.
Yeah, I mean, I hope I'm not hogging the thing, trying to, you know, I'm not meant to be interviewing, but I'm just so curious about this, because in some ways, the time something takes is completely irrelevant.
Yes.
Yeah. I would argue it has nothing at all to do with it. I mean, it's interesting, and we can be curious about it, and it's enjoyable, but it's really irrelevant.
Absolutely.
You did it. You did it. I mean, what's it got to do with anything? You know.
So how do you decide then? How do you decide when it's finished?
Yeah, I'm the sort of person who thinks that nothing's finished. Nothing's ever finished. There's, you know, but that said, I'm incredibly happy and comfortable it's out now. So,
what made you send it off to the publisher?
I just thought that I got to the point where I couldn't make it any better. You know, I had given it everything and I was broken and that was it.
Sorry,
and then
Sofie,
did you just send it off to someone?
Yes, I did.
Then you just sent it to your publisher.
I don't have time to be looking at this. And I went, I reckon you're going to make time. I'm not the sort of person who usually does that, but I just went, I'm not taking no for an answer.
Wow.
So tell me then about, I mean, Sofie, your character, Lawrence, you know, he has feelings for two young boys. And you know that obviously those are feelings that are very much frowned upon by society. Writing about that sort of, and it is love. He feels love for the two boys. Writing, was that hard to bring to life, and not necessarily the feeling, but to actually sort of give it form for a book?
I don't recall that it was. I don't recall that it was. I knew he loved his uncle as well, and that was that's complicated love, isn't it? I don't know that it was complicated for Lawrence when he was 10. I don't know that his love for his uncle wasn't complicated then, was it? He loved with his whole heart.
And
the way a child loves.
And that love was abused, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So the love then he felt then for those children was that I would call that probably really complicated. It's funny, isn't it? Because when he was experiencing it, was it complicated for him? It was very passionate. When he felt it, it was. I mean, he wouldn't have felt it as complicated, would he? I mean,
no,
he would have.
No.
He wouldn't have. Yeah, it's
but it seemed to me he saw it.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, he saw it as a way of being how he was before his love had been abused by his uncle.
I think that was one of the threads in there. that it restored him. This is unconscious. I mean, writers have the advantage of being able to, it is artifice in a way, you know, we can give our characters some self-knowing, you know, there is some license there, you know, because he is able to articulate that the boy restored him to some time that was lost. And I don't know, you know, that's craft, isn't it? I don't know in real life if one is always able to find words for that experience, perhaps. So yeah, it was one of the threads. But I mean, he did feel desire, and he couldn't probably separate. Well, it was all mixed up. It was complicated, and it was yeah, I mean, you could diagnose those feelings. They weren't healthy, but in his world, they were. He couldn't separate sexual desire. He idealized the boys. He cared for the boys. You couldn't even take out that. He did care.
Yeah.
He didn't completely objectify them. They were human to him, but he did. They were fantasy as well. It's complicated.
But he discovers, doesn't he? He discovers two other strong loves that sort of save him in a sense.
They do. They really do.
Particularly a love of art.
Yeah. And they allowed him to be in love with life, I think. His love of nature, his love of his environment, his love of the natural world. Yeah.
The setting of the book is hugely important, I think.
He was in love with his life, I think, from a very young age. He loved the mountain. He passionately loved that mountain.
So it's set in the foot.
Sorry, he lived in the Grampians, the foot of the southern Grampians. And there's a fictionalized mountain loosely based on one of the mountains there, Mount Sturgeon. And really there is a school at the foot of Mount Sturgeon. And I would imagine the lives of those school children in that town with that mountain behind them, how beautiful that would be. And so he was in love with that mountain. He loved his life. He loved his school. He loved learning. We can be, our love for those things, maybe it's not complicated, that love, but he was really wide open to that richness that life has. And he did. And anyway, I digress, I'm sure. It's interesting though, isn't it? You can't separate. Yeah. Love is mixed in with
so much.
And if I may, Sophie, just jump in too. Sorry, I just feel like his love of art, that is so tied up in his love of his uncle too.
Exactly.
So, and that's
he gave his uncle
life, though, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's something that I've learned about the grooming process, about being groomed, and I don't know the right word, the groomer. It's very difficult to extricate your feelings of love from the person who's groomed you. That's what's so cruel about it. The power inherent in grooming a young person. It takes a life it's never done. It's a process you can't. I don't know if you can ever truly be successful, but you can be in love with art, and that gives you a reason to live. And I don't think everybody. I don't know that everybody gets to experience the passion that Lawrence experiences in the world.
I wondered whether Campbell, whether in a similar way, the boy's love of water and the love of swimming was to an extent similar to Lawrence's love of art and the natural world. I mean, their absolute commitment to being in water at moments of extreme tension and crisis.
Yeah, on the surface of things, they're swimmers who are good enough to possibly swim at the Olympics. However, water and swimming is intensely emotional for them, and because water kind of represents their mother who they've lost, who was a swimmer, but also there was just something about water and them being twins and having been in the womb together. This thing that the first time one of the twin brothers jumps in the water after their mother dies, as soon as they're inside that water, they feel closer to their mother. So from then on, they're just obsessed with jumping in the water because it brings them brings them closer to their mother. And there's this thing that if we swim fast to the other side, she might be waiting there, kind of thing going on. But it's really it's the sensation of being inside the water that's the thing. And so
and they swim in that place, don't they? They swim at a place called the Warmies, where the water is sort of nurturing, isn't it?
Which is a real place and is and is the real name of the place, and it's known as the Warmies because it's where the hot water comes out of the Newport Power Station. And so so even the water that they're swimming in is warm. And they're swimming against that current, which, writers all love things like Against the Current.
But Emily, in the other sort of complicated love in love objects is Lena, who is Nick's niece, who is very keen on a bloke at university, but then is her love, for want of another word, is exploited and abused by him. And I mean, it's much more than a simple event in the novel, isn't it? I mean, you're making significant comments about sexual politics and the relationships between the power relationships between men and women, and also class aspects of the relationship, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's all in there for sure. I don't know how it would not be in there, all of those political readings. To me, in terms of writing the character of Lena, I guess I never thought of her feelings for this bloke, Josh, as love, but there's definitely lust. There's definitely a really strong attraction. And I think
I was using the word love very loosely there.
It's in our title. But I do think there's love in that interaction, in that she loves the feeling she has around him. Lena is someone who's first in her family to go to university. She thinks of herself as quite stupid compared to her classmates. It's been a bit of a difficult path to get there. And this bloke makes her feel like the person that she wants to be and imagines she'll be. And she kind of loved herself in the first sort of blush of that. It's something, this is either a warning or a promise. There's a really explicit sex scene in chapter 2 between Lena and Josh. And it was really important to me to have that way to show that she is loving it. She has a really good time, and she's very much in control of that. And it's as much about her feeling great as it is anything else. What happens after that, when she discovers that he's filmed the encounter without her consent, then comes the shame and that mismatch of power and all those kind of things. But the sex itself, the interaction itself, was actually something in which I do kind of think, it's a bit of a glib phrase, that she's loving herself after that.
But she does take it back into her hands, doesn't she, eventually? Which is, I thought that was
I mean, it's something that I was just talking to a book group the other night, actually, and they were all kind of angry that Josh wasn't more severely punished, which is a little bit of a spoiler. I won't say how exactly it plays out, but there's definitely a feeler among some readers that he really should have got a lot worse off than he does. But I was trying to keep it pretty realistic as well, which is that, at a point, we tell our kids and told ourselves from a really young age now that once something's out on the internet, you're not really getting it back. And so there's that to face up with. And also that probably for this particular young guy, the consequences just aren't going to be that severe. And so, Lena needs to find a way to, I guess, get rid of the shame and the self-blame and the feeling that she's the one who has done something bad and needs to hide away. That I think that's more, she's getting back to that point of feeling like she hasn't done anything wrong, which is how she felt right after the sex.
All your characters, all the books, siblings are very important because Emily, Will and Lena have had a tense relationship, but there's a lot of love there, and their relationship is very important to the outcome of the book. Obviously, Campbell, the relationship of the two brothers is essential. And Sofie, we haven't really mentioned much about Lawrence's relationship with his brother. Paul is mainly off stage, but there's a lot of love there that Paul has for Lawrence and vice versa. But it's not always overt. I mean, with Campbell, the boys, they know they love each other, and they tell each other that they love each other. You know, what does he say? We are a love song. I think John says to Eden. But the sibling relationship is crucial to all your books, and I just wondered how you approached that, and how important you wanted to make them.
Yeah, I think initially, given that an element of the storyline of my book is that the twins fall in love with the same girl, there's always an element of complicated love there.
Yeah.
But as I was saying earlier, the thing that took a long time for me to kind of realize as the writer, I guess, was that I was always aware that the narrator, or John, was absolutely desperate for the approval of his twin. He wants his twin's approval. And it took me a long time to realize that his twin is desperate for his approval too. And that John is never really aware of that. And so I kind of became a bit fascinated by that in the interaction, and going back through the novel, that was probably one of the things I worked on the most of, that Eden, his brother, is not overly good at expressing such things, though if you look for it, it's there the whole time, that he wants approval from his brother the whole time. Like the amount of care that Eden has for John is exceptional, but John doesn't see it. He doesn't see it because he's so desperately looking for his own approval, which I think is the kind of tragedy that a lot of us live.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if he describes, if it's himself who does, but he's described as the other half of Eden, isn't he?
Yeah. He says that, every time I'm asked my name, I have to stop myself from saying the other half of Eden.
Yeah. But so, Sofie, why, you keep Paul, who is Lawrence's brother, you keep him, they're very different. And Paul's relationship with Lawrence is to a certain extent formed by the fact that Lawrence has protected him, hasn't he, as a child?
Yes. Yeah, I'm just sitting here thinking about them. I knew I wanted them to be close as boys. I mean, they were in a country town. They lived on the edges of town. They didn't have a father. Yeah, they were very close there. Their mother was a little bit distant. They enjoyed each other immensely, didn't they? They loved being with each other. There was rivalry, but there was only, there wasn't too much. It was managed. I think I was setting all that up to show. That's what I think. That's what I was doing. I was setting up that up to show how divisive the uncle's abuse was going to be for the rest of their lives. That was one of the consequences. He was going to divide them. Yeah. He set out to divide them, and he successfully did so.
But Lawrence does, by being the one who's abused, he sort of protects Paul, doesn't he?
He did. He was conscious of that. He said, I'd rather, and I understand what he meant when he said, it's easier sort of to experience the awful thing yourself and know what it was like than to wonder what it would be like for my brother. Sort of to absorb it and have it happen to yourself is preferable. It was unbearable to imagine. And that is what older siblings do, isn't it? Do you guys all have siblings? Do you have siblings, Campbell and Emily?
Yes, I do. I have an older brother.
Emily?
Yeah, I've got 2 sisters and a brother. Yeah.
I mean, they're complicated. Sibling relationships are complicated. I mean, talking of complicated love, and then they're complicated in all of the books, but they are complicated, and that must be why they're there in the books. Because, they're different to friendships. They're different to any other kind of love, you would have to agree.
Well, you choose your friends, don't you?
They are
you choose your friends. Yeah. Sorry, what was that?
They are ultra complicated relationships.
Yeah, because you all grew up under the same roof. And
But that doesn't mean you had the same experience of childhood, which is where it's really complicated. Like Lawrence and Paul is an extreme example, but for all of us, there's 4 of us, and we have a group chat that we have been communicating on all throughout lockout, and really bringing up stuff from our childhoods that we haven't talked about for years. And it's like we lived in 4 separate houses, like 4 separate realities with just a few, like, it's like some weird, surreal thing where there'll be touch points that we sort of meet up at, but then everything's so different. It's really interesting.
But it's pretty amazing you're all talking during lockdown and having this weekly call. That's pretty fantastic.
Oh yeah, I mean we are close. We are really close siblings, but in a way that makes it even more surprising that we just remember our childhood so differently, and our parents. We each have really different relationships with our parents, and that stuff. I've written 2 sets of siblings in this book. My previous novel was about sisters. Like, I'm obviously pretty interested in these relationships. As Campbell said, they tend to be really, really complicated, and that's when everyone loves each other. That's not even taking into relationships where siblings fall out. Like, even when you all love each other, it can be really. I mean, sometimes I think I don't know the drama in a sense of writing and reading that comes from relationships where there's no enemy and there's no bad guy. There's just people who love each other and have really different ideas about how to live and how best to express that. But that's where that really kind of rich conflict comes.
Yeah.
I suppose that's why there are so many books about families, I suppose.
So many.
They're always complicated. How did your brother react to your book, Campbell?
I don't think that he's read it.
That complicated.
I would be highly surprised if he has read it. Yes.
Have you told him? I mean, he knows it's a book about.
Oh yeah, he definitely knows about it. He's commented on it, but not in a. He's commented on the reaction to it, not on the substance of it.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
It doesn't surprise me. That's how complicated it is with siblings.
Yeah, that's it. That's the least of the complications. I'm not terribly fussed about that. But one thing I should have said, the tragic death of somebody that kind of inspired the initial writing of this book. That person was a twin, so so that was why I initially started with twins, and I was always kind of aware and wondering about what it was like for the twin that was left, and so that was part of the starting point for me. And the other thing was that a good friend of mine actually is a twin, but she's estranged from her twin and has been estranged since I was 16. And so, since you say twins, people tend to think it's going to be a story about how close they are when there's ESP. And I was really conscious that and subsequent to the book coming out, people who are parents of twins have contacted me and said the thing that defines my twins is how determined they are to have their own separate identity. And because of this friend who's estranged, that was always a really keen thing with me, that the twins weren't the same person. But yeah, estranged twins.
Oh.
There you go.
I've never heard of estranged twins.
Yeah.
That's painful. That must be painful for them.
Must be painful.
Yeah.
Yes.
The other one thing I wanted to ask you, Campbell, was about the scene in which the parents are killed in a car crash. I mean, that's a very, very vivid scene, and it's quite sort of it's not quite horrific, but almost. And I just wondered, it really stands out in the book.
Yeah, I mean,
and I just wondered about the writing of that.
Well, you've stumbled upon something there, because it's actually, when I said earlier that three or so years ago, I kind of threw the whole book out and started from scratch. But obviously, with 27 years of history of there were some scenes I could type out.
Yeah.
The only scene that survived and is not rewritten is the crash scene.
Really?
So that was actually written in 1990. And so it's obviously been honed, but that scene is quite remarkably intact.
Gosh. I mean, it's a very, very powerful scene. Very powerful, I thought.
Yeah, and that was kind of the very opening, and it almost still is the very opening, but it's led into a little.
Yeah. But it's
and one of the to really get into the nuts and bolts, over the course of time, your writing style changes.
Of course, yes.
There's certain things that I used to do as a matter of course as a writer that I, never do now. Just little, grammatical things as much as anything. And so to get that scene to be in the same style or to suit the rest of the book was something of a challenge.
Yeah, that's an interesting. And obviously, you're a very different person from when you started the book, I dare say.
Yeah. I mean, one of the the turning point for the writing of the book, like what happened 3 years ago that made me throw it out, is that I typed the word. Bobby says very early in the novel, Bobby turns to one of the twins and says, when he's kind of reacting that, who is this woman? He's never lived with his grandmother before, and and she'd married into the family. But it was complicated. And she turns to him and said, she notices that he's uncomfortable, and she says, "Life's different on the other side of youth." And as soon as she said that, it was the first time I'd really felt her voice after all these years. I went, "That's how she talks." And I feel like as the writer, I kind of needed to get on the other side of youth to do this book justice.
Yeah, gosh, that's interesting. Okay, now we should take some questions from, there are a couple of questions in already from audience members. So this is a question from Paul. He says, does the historic concept of love need to be revisited and refined for this 21st century world and our pandemic world?
I don't know if there is maybe this is the big difficulty with talking all this. There isn't really a single historic concept of love, is there? I mean, we keep using it in so many ways. It describes so many different kinds of relationships that there isn't one thing. I mean, you can talk about the love of your life and love for parents and talk about loving chocolate. Like, it's a word that has so many applications. And that means something really different. But I mean, I think just in terms of the pandemic world, there's something about, in terms of, I guess, family love or really close relationships and friendships, that I think a lot of people are, whether they're articulating it or not, I feel like a lot of people are kind of maybe reassessing what those those relationships are and what those links are, sort of who your people are, not just who you're missing, but who are the ones, you know, I'm really interested in how we kind of feel responsibility for each other as family or as community or whatever. Like, where's the sort of end of my circle? And in ordinary or pre-pandemic life, there is something that's just sort of, I don't know, it just happens that the people are around you who are the ones you're closest to. But when it takes this effort and this need to reach out and to find people and to check that they're okay, I don't know, I think there is a natural reassessment going on for a lot of people.
So
I think Emily has answered that question perfectly.
Beautifully. I agree.
Thanks, Campbell.
Yeah.
Okay, then let's find another question. This comes from Sally. And Sally would like to know what the role of parental love is in each of your novels. Right. Who's going to start with that one? Emily, you were the only one who answered the first question, so perhaps you could go last on this one.
The role of parental love, the role of parental love in our novels. Well, parental love is all. Parental love sets up the way siblings love each other. We talk about how complicated it is with your living siblings and your siblings in your fiction. That's because of parental love or lack of, or how love is expressed, or relationships really more than love. Yeah, I mean, if I think of the mother of Lawrence and Paul's mother in the story, they're always hungry for her love. They want to feel her touch. They want her approval. They want to be close with her, and yet ultimately she will betray. Is that the word you use? If you she will never question. She'll put her brother, the love or the idealized version of her brother. She will put that is in front of everything else. I'm not they're not great words. I suppose what I'm saying is, isn't it terrible that even though she has living children, she's going to damage Lawrence. Her eyes will not be open because she won't have been able to grow beyond that idea she has about her own brother. So that's the sorts of things we do to the people that we so love. That's what we do. She does, you can see she loves Lawrence. She's going to love him all her life. She'll die on her deathbed. She'll die concerned about his well-being. And yet she won't be able to protect him from her own brother. And in a way, you could argue that her failure to protect him is as brutal abuse as what the uncle does. I'm sure you couldn't really say that, but you understand what I'm trying to speak to.
She's failed her son in that respect, hasn't she?
And what a respect that is.
Yeah.
And as a result, it's going to mean that Paul and Lawrence are always going to be compromised. The relationship can never really grow in the way that might have been a lot more satisfying. But you could also argue that as a result of this deprivation, his paintings will be enriched. And this is my idea, this is my fantasy of the story, and that generations of Australians and people all over the world will be the richer for it. Isn't that strange how life works?
Parental love for you, Campbell?
It's an interesting one in the book because obviously the parents die at the start of the book, so there's no parental love, but
in loco parentis, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, the parents, particularly their mother, exists throughout the book, and in terms of love objects, there's a picture of their mum on the wall of their grandparents' house that the two boys always fight fight for the chair that has the best view of it. And so, you know, that's a lot. That's a love object for them. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Just one thing to put into context, to slightly ignore the question a little bit. I started writing this book 10 years before my son was born, and my son's now 21. I mentioned that because of what I was saying earlier. In terms of, he has heard about this book his whole life, but not for a word. But he read it when it came out, and he's 21. He's not, you know, he's not 3, and he's far more astute at the assessment of books than what I am. And he said, "You know what you've done, Dad? You've written a love letter to your brother." And he knows what the actual relationship with his brother is. And so I thought that pretty much summed up the book.
Emily, no, we've only got 4 minutes left, but the parental relationship is important in love objects, because Lena and Will's mother has, well, they're not. She's up in Queensland, and they're down in Sydney. And Nick is virtually has virtually been a sort of parental stand-in for Michelle, with Lena certainly. And yet, I was just going to say that Nick has, but also stood away from Will for a period of time. I don't want to give too much away.
No, I think the thing is, Nick sees herself as practically a second mother for these kids when they're little, and especially Lena. And she kind of holds that to her. She's the first person to literally hold Lena when she's born, because of circumstances. And she really thinks of them as her kids, but they're not. And when their mum moves, so their father dies, you know, before the book starts, when they're quite young. So, and they have so much love for him. He is really beloved, but he's gone, and their mum moves to another state, and so they lose their auntie, who thought of herself as their mother as well. And it was important to me that Michelle's not a bad guy in this, and she's not a terrible mother, and she's not trying to split everyone up. She had just lost her husband and had this other family crisis going on with her son, and she does the best she can. And that, you know, in some ways is not good enough, but it's absolutely the best she can. And, you know, again, I sort of this being really interested in these stories where even when people love each other and are doing their very best, they fall through the cracks. And Nick, hopes to be that kind of figure, but she doesn't. She lets down Will at a really important moment too.
And she resents her sister for taking them away from her, doesn't she? She does.
She relates to her colleagues who are divorced parents, so they'll sort of be bitching about the other parent whilst trying to maintain a relationship with the kids, and she feels that way about her sister taking those kids away. But of course, she doesn't have any legal or socially sanctioned kind of right to these kids.
Okay, we've got about a minute left, and there's a question specifically for you, Emily. From Megan, wants to know, was there a particular inspiration for the writing of love objects?
Oh, well, I'll answer quickly. There were 2 that came together, and they're both like things I've been thinking about for at least a decade. One was the relationship with objects. I have a few people in my life who would be called hoarders. They wouldn't self-identify as that. And I wanted to find a way to write about that relationship through fiction. And the other was actually that auntie niece-nephew relationship, which is something that I'm really interested in, that kind of secondary family member, not quite the nuclear family, and how that plays out. So those were sort of the 2 inspirations that came together in making this novel.
Okay, I wonder if we can squeeze in one more question here from Paul, and you're going to have to be very, very swift with these, golly, and it's a question that could go on forever, the answers rather. From your own writing, is love within families a different form of love to other forms or dimensions of love? Crikey. from your
well,
own
just like
writing?
Emily said, that word, we can love chocolate and love our mother. Is it different? Is it a different form? Well, love's just a word, and there's a whole lot of different experiences that word encompasses. Yeah, family love is particularly complicated of all the loves, isn't it? Family love will decide the other loves, including chocolate.
Yeah, yeah,
For many of us.
yes.
There's something about knowing someone from birth as well that I think complicates things later on too, when you know, if you have the experience of talking to a sibling and seeing them sort of simultaneously, or parents do this with kids too, you simultaneously are seeing a 3-year-old and a 40-year-old at the same time, and I feel like that can really complicate your reactions to things, and you yourself are a 3-year-old and a 40-year-old at the same time. It's
really interesting. I've actually been thinking, having young kids, you know, I think to myself, even though they were, you did carry them, they are entirely themselves. They are entirely, you really have, that's it. Once you push them out, that's absolutely it. I know that's what I've been thinking. Yeah, they are, even though it took your genes or whatever, it's just something I've been thinking, pondering lately. They are entirely separate. That's it. Yeah, I can't find a more sophisticated way to describe that sensation I've had lately.
You couldn't be more true. So
yeah. Oh, you reckon? You agree? Yeah.
Well,
maybe before I had kids, I might have imagined, oh, the shadow of you, or it's not true.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just,
whenever somebody
with
says,
a channel,
you must be so proud of X child, and I go, well, if I take credit for that, then I have to take credit for all the actions.
I still look on. I'm still. I look at my 2 children, and they're a complete mystery to me in a way.
Yeah.
You know,
you were just the means for them to get here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I reckon. That's, but I mean, what it boils, I suppose, you know, in this subject of complicated love, it's the family, isn't it? It's the family that is the family puts the complications in there.
It will keep novelists in business for a lifetime.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, we've pretty well sort of reached, we've gone over our allotted time. So I would like to thank you, Sofie, and you, Emily, and you, Campbell, for your time tonight and for your books, which are very, very impressive, moving, and very engaging, and books that I've hugely enjoyed. And I would like to thank you, the audience members who've taken the time to tune in tonight. If you do want to buy the books, if you are in Albury, you can get them from Dimmock's at Albury, where they're offering a 25% off during lockdown. And if you are in Albury, they will deliver them to you for free. So I recommend that. And if you're not in Albury, well, many bookshops are doing click and collect. So I really, really strongly recommend that you get to grips with Campbell's We Were Not Men, Emily Maguire's Love Objects, and Sofie Laguna's Infinite Splendors. And Right Around the Murray goes on tomorrow. There's Sofie is talking about creating captivating children's books, because she has a new book out, The Adventures of Lewis Carmichael, and she'll be in conversation with Ursula Dubosarski, Lee Hobbs, and Lee Walker. And there's also a session on historical fictions tomorrow with Anita Heiss, Jock Sarong, and Dorothy Simmons. And I'm going to be asking the questions again for that. There's more information at the Right Around the Murray website. So do go there. And thank you very much indeed.
Thank you,
and good night.
Thank you.